The wind was a predator, a howling beast of ice and fury that clawed at the pines and scoured the very soul from the land. For Alara, it was a mirror to the terror that had chased her for weeks across the unforgiving frontier. Each gust that tore at her thin cloak was the voice of Bartholomew Thorne, the man she was fleeing, a man whose promises had been as beautiful as a sunrise and whose true nature was as cruel as this godforsaken blizzard. The pain that ripped through her was no longer just the cold that had seeped into her bones. It was the searing, primal agony of childbirth. Alone. She was utterly alone, a ghost in a world of white, with a new life fighting its way into an existence that seemed already doomed. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the deepening snow, a cry stolen from her lips by the gale. The world was a dizzying vortex of white, the sky indistinguishable from the earth. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, a final, desperate prayer whispered into the storm. It was not a prayer for her own life, but for the innocent one she had carried so far, a tiny flicker of hope against a universe of despair. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the unpitying swirl of snow, a final, cold blanket over a life surrendered. Her story, it seemed, was over. But what if the end is not the end? What if the moment we feel most lost, most abandoned, is the very moment that grace is about to find us? This is the story of a love born in the heart of a storm, a testament to the fact that even in the most desolate of winters, the smallest spark of human kindness can build a fire strong enough to save a soul. Have you ever wondered what becomes of a person pushed to the absolute edge of their endurance? What happens when there is nothing left but the will to survive and a prayer that feels lost on the wind? This is where our story truly begins, not with an ending in the snow, but with a beginning forged in the hearth of an unexpected sanctuary. Miles from anywhere, nestled in a valley that had long ago been forgotten by mapmakers, stood a solitary cabin. It was the domain of Silas, a man who had built walls not only of timber and mud but of silence and solitude around his heart. The war had taken his nerve for crowds, and a fever had stolen his wife and son, leaving him with a quiet so profound it had its own sound, the creak of old wood, the sigh of the wind, the crackle of a lonely fire. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts: honor, grief, and a competence born of necessity. He moved through his cabin with the economy of a man who has no one to impress, his face a mask of stoic indifference carved by loss. He had thought he was done with the world, content to let it spin on without him. But the world, it seemed, was not done with him. A sound, faint and unnatural, snagged his attention, a high, thin cry that was almost indistinguishable from the shriek of the wind. It was a sound that did not belong in his ordered, empty world. He pulled on his heavy coat, a frown etched deep into his brow, and took up his rifle more from habit than fear. Pushing open the heavy door, he was met with a wall of white. But there, a dark shape against the endless snow, was a collapsed figure. A woman. His first instinct, the one honed by years of self-preservation and a desire to be left alone, was to retreat, to bar the door and pretend he had seen nothing. But a deeper instinct, the core of the man he was before sorrow had hollowed him out, rebelled. It was the part of him that knew right from wrong, the part that had once sworn to protect. With a heavy sigh that turned to a plume of white in the frozen air, Silas strode into the blizzard, his long-forgotten heart beating a reluctant, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He knelt, turning her gently, and saw the swell of her belly beneath the threadbare cloak. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the storm, that his solitude was over. He carried her inside, her weight almost nothing in his powerful arms, and laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth. She was a slip of a thing, her face pale as the snow she'd been lost in, her hair a cascade of dark silk against the floor. He worked with a grim, focused efficiency, stoking the dying embers in the fireplace until they roared back to life, casting a flickering, golden glow over the scene. The warmth began to fill the small cabin, a stark contrast to the howling wilderness outside. As the heat touched her skin, Alara stirred, a low moan escaping her lips, and her eyes fluttered open. They were wide with a terror so profound it struck Silas to his core. He saw not a woman, but a cornered animal, ready to fight or flee. He held up his hands, a gesture of peace. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "The storm, you were caught in it." But as she tried to push herself up, a wave of agony washed over her, and she cried out, her back arching. It was then he understood the true, desperate nature of her plight. The child was coming. Now, Silas was a man who could track a deer for 3 days, build a shelter from nothing, and face down a grizzly, but he knew nothing of this. A tremor of panic, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, shot through him. He saw the ghost of his own wife, her face pale with fever, and for a second, he was paralyzed by the memory of his own helplessness. But the woman Alara cried out again, a sound of pure, unendurable pain, and it shattered his paralysis. He would not be helpless again. He moved to her side, his hands, usually so steady with an axe or a rifle, now feeling clumsy and huge. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice gentler than he intended. "Just breathe." He gathered blankets, boiled water, and followed the primal, unspoken instructions of the moment. Through the long, harrowing hours of the night, as the blizzard raged outside, a silent, solitary man and a terrified, determined woman worked together, strangers bound by the most fundamental of human dramas. And then, as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the cabin's single window, a new cry joined the howl of the wind, thin, reedy, but utterly alive. A daughter. Alara lay exhausted, sweat-sheened and pale, but her eyes were fixed on the tiny, squirming bundle Silas wrapped in a clean blanket and placed in her arms. He retreated to the shadows of the room, watching as she wept, not from pain, but from a wave of overwhelming, miraculous relief. He had built a fire to warm her body, but in the heart of his desolate cabin, a new life had kindled a flame he thought had been extinguished forever. The days that followed were draped in a thick, watchful silence. The blizzard had locked them away from the world, encasing the small cabin in a cocoon of snow and quiet. For Alara, waking each morning was a disorienting miracle. She was alive. Her baby was alive. But she was a prisoner of a different sort, captive to the kindness of a stranger whose face was a landscape of unreadable sorrow. She watched him from the makeshift bed he had arranged for her near the fire. He moved with a quiet, powerful grace, tending to the cabin's needs with an ingrained competence. He chopped wood, his axe falling with a clean, rhythmic thud that became the heartbeat of their days. He hunted, returning with fresh game that he would skin and cook without a word, leaving a plate of food by her side before retreating to his own corner of the room. He was a ghost in his own home, a provider of warmth and sustenance who seemed to demand nothing in return, not even a conversation. His gaze would often drift to the fire, but it would deliberately, almost painfully, avoid her and the small bundle in her arms. Alara understood this avoidance. She saw the ghosts that haunted his eyes whenever he thought she wasn't looking. This man, her savior, was wounded in a way she could only guess at. Fear, a constant companion for so long, began to slowly recede, replaced by a deep, aching curiosity. Who was this man who had saved her life but refused to share his own? "Thank you," she said one afternoon, her voice still weak but clear. He was sharpening a knife by the window, and he paused, his shoulders tensing as if the words were a physical blow. He merely nodded, not turning around. "My name is Alara," she offered to his back. "And this is hope." She looked down at the sleeping infant, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. The name had come to her in the quiet hours of the night, a defiant declaration against the despair that had almost consumed her. At the name, Silas finally turned. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers for a fleeting moment. She saw a flicker of something raw and painful in their depths before the mask of indifference slammed down again. He gave another short, sharp nod and returned to his work. The silence that followed was different, no longer empty but filled with the weight of their shared space, of a name spoken aloud, of a life named hope. A fragile bridge of words had been built across the chasm of their solitude, and though neither was yet ready to cross it, its presence changed everything. Weeks melted into a month. The relentless snow began to soften, the iron grip of winter showing the first signs of release. Inside the cabin, a similar, almost imperceptible thaw was taking place. The rigid silence that had defined their first days together began to fracture, giving way to the small, necessary sounds of a shared life. The baby's cries, Alara's soft humming of a forgotten lullaby, the scrape of a spoon against a wooden bowl. These noises wove themselves into the fabric of the cabin, stitching a life where before there had been only an existence. Alara, her strength returning day by day, refused to remain an invalid. She began to mend Silas's worn shirts, her needle moving with a delicate precision that spoke of a different life, a life of parlors and finer things. She organized his sparse shelves, bringing a subtle order to the masculine clutter. She did not ask permission. She simply began to make the space her own, a quiet assertion that she was no longer just a rescued victim, but a part of this home. Silas watched her, his expression guarded, but he did not stop her. He found a strange comfort in the quiet industry she brought to his home, a domesticity he had long ago banished along with all other painful reminders of his past. The most significant change, however, centered around the child. For weeks, Silas had treated Hope as if she were made of glass, a fragile ghost he was afraid to touch. But the baby's presence was an undeniable, relentless force of nature. One evening, Alara, bone-weary and half asleep, was struggling to soothe the infant's fretful cries. The sound grated on the raw edges of Silas's grief, a piercing reminder of the son he had lost. He felt the old impulse to retreat, to block out the sound and the pain it carried. He stood, ready to go outside and split wood until his arms ached and his mind was numb. But he stopped. He looked at Alara's exhausted face, at the tiny, red-faced infant, and a different impulse, one he hadn't felt in years, took hold. It was the impulse to protect, to soothe, to help. He walked over, his boots silent on the wooden floor. "Here," he said, his voice gruff. He held out his arms. Alara looked up, startled, but she saw no threat in his eyes, only a weary resignation. She carefully handed the baby to him. He took her, his large, calloused hands looking impossibly gentle as they cradled the small form. He held Hope against his broad chest, and as he began to pace the length of the cabin, the baby's cries slowly subsided, replaced by soft, hiccuping breaths. He did not look at Alara. His gaze was fixed on the tiny face nestled in the crook of his arm. And as he held her, he felt the glacier that had encased his heart for so long begin to groan and shift. A single treacherous crack appeared, and through it, a sliver of warmth, terrifying and yet undeniably real, began to seep in. The dam of their silence, once cracked, began to crumble in earnest. It did not happen in a flood of confession, but in a slow, steady trickle of shared moments and tentative words exchanged in the firelight. The long evenings, once filled with unspoken tension, became a time of quiet communion. The questions they asked were simple, yet they carried the weight of their pasts. "Where did you learn to stitch so fine?" he asked one night, watching her repair a tear in his coat with nearly invisible seams. She smiled, a rare and beautiful thing that lit up her face. "I was a governess for a time. In Boston." The words painted a picture of a world so far removed from this rugged cabin it seemed like a dream. She told him of her love for books, for learning, a life of quiet respectability that she had thrown away for the promises of a handsome, wealthy man. That man was Bartholomew Thorne. As she spoke his name, the air in the cabin grew cold again. She told Silas everything, of Thorne's charm that slowly curdled into possessiveness, his affection that became a cage, and her terrifying realization that the child she carried was seen by him not as a blessing, but as another possession to be controlled. Her escape had not been an act of courage, but of pure, animal desperation. Silas listened, his hands clenched into fists, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The quiet honor that was the bedrock of his soul recoiled at the thought of such a man. He saw in Alara's story a reflection of all the world's casual cruelty, the very thing he had retreated to this valley to escape. The anger he felt on her behalf was a clean, righteous fire, burning away the last vestiges of his apathy. His story, when he offered it, came in clipped, broken pieces like fragments of a shattered pot. He spoke of a farm, of a wife named Mary with hair the color of wheat, and of a boy, Daniel, who had his mother's smile. He did not speak of love or happiness. He spoke only of the fever, the swift, merciless illness that had swept through their homestead and taken them both within a week, leaving him to dig 2 graves in the frozen earth alone. He had sold the farm and walked west, not looking for anything, but simply walking away from the emptiness. In the shared geography of their scars, they found a common ground. They were 2 survivors, 2 souls who had been stripped of everything and left for dead by fate and cruelty. The next day, Silas took her outside. He pressed his own rifle into her hands. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice firm. "Not just to hunt, to protect what's yours." As he stood behind her, his hands guiding hers to show her how to aim, his touch was no longer that of a rescuer, but of a partner. He was not just giving her a weapon. He was giving her back a piece of the agency that had been stolen from her. And in teaching her to be strong, he was rediscovering his own purpose. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest but as a conquering force, waging a war of attrition against the long winter. The sun grew stronger, the days longer. The snow retreated from the valley floor, revealing the damp, dark earth, and the creeks swelled with the sound of melting ice, a roar of liberation that echoed the changes in the cabin. The world was opening up, and with it came a sense of fragile, burgeoning hope. Silas and Alara had fallen into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like life. They planted a small garden with seeds Silas had kept stored away, their hands working together in the rich soil. He taught her the names of the wild herbs that grew on the hillside, and she taught him the words to lullabies she remembered from her own childhood. Hope, now a thriving, gurgling infant, was the sun around which their small universe revolved. She was Silas's shadow, her eyes tracking him as he moved about his chores, and her first smile was reserved for him, a gummy, wholehearted grin that completely dismantled the last of his defenses. The love they felt for the child became a bridge between them, a love so pure and powerful it left no room for the ghosts of the past. Their own affection grew in the silences, in the shared glances over the baby's head, in the easy comfort of their proximity. It was a love that needed no grand declarations, for it was as solid and real as the mountains that surrounded them. But the melting snows that brought life back to the valley also cleared the paths. And a path cleared for a friend is also a path cleared for an enemy. One afternoon, as Alara was hanging laundered baby clothes on a line Silas had strung between 2 pines, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The jingle of harnesses and the confident, cruel laughter of men who were not used to being denied. She turned, her heart seizing in her chest. At the edge of the clearing, on horseback, sat 3 men. And at their lead, looking as arrogant and proprietary as he had in her nightmares, was Bartholomew Thorne. He dismounted, his expensive leather boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, a smug smile playing on his lips. He took in the scene, the rustic cabin, the woman he considered his, the evidence of a child, and his smile hardened into a sneer of contempt. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It seems you've made a little nest for yourself. Did you truly think you could hide from me, my dear? Did you think I would simply let you walk away with my property?" He gestured toward the cabin, and toward the baby clothes fluttering on the line, as if they were all items in an inventory. The shadow of his presence fell over their sanctuary, a blight on the new world they had so carefully built. The peace was shattered. The past had found them. Silas emerged from the cabin, a rifle held loosely but ready in his hands. He did not look surprised, only grimly resigned, as if he had been expecting this day all along. He moved to stand beside Alara, a silent, unshakable wall of protection. His presence was a comfort, but the fear that gripped Alara was a cold, familiar poison. She saw Thorne's eyes, the possessive fire in them, and she was transported back to a life of suffocating control and veiled threats. But then she felt the solid warmth of Silas at her side, and she looked at the cabin that had become her home, and she thought of the daughter sleeping peacefully inside. And the fear was consumed by a white-hot, protective rage. This was her life now. This was her family, and no one was going to take it from her. "She is not your property, Thorn," Silas said, his voice low and steady, carrying a lethal quietness that was far more intimidating than any shout. "And this is my land. You and your men will leave now." Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree. "Your land? This hovel? I could buy this entire valley and turn it into my personal hunting ground. And as for the woman," he sneered, his gaze locking onto Alara, "she made a promise. She carries my child. She belongs to me." "The child is hers," Silas stated, his voice dropping even lower. "And she belongs to no one but herself. This is your only warning." The moment stretched, taut and vibrating with violence. Thorn, accustomed to a world where his wealth and will were law, could not comprehend the quiet defiance of this mountain man. He saw only a rustic obstacle. "I have come for what is mine," Thorn declared, and he nodded to his 2 hired men, who began to dismount, their hands moving toward the pistols at their belts. What happened next was a blur of savage, efficient motion. Silas did not wait for them to draw. The rifle came up to his shoulder with a speed that belied its weight, and he fired 2 shots, not to kill but to maim. One shot splintered the stock of a man's pistol as he drew it. The other tore through the fleshy part of the second man's thigh, sending him screaming to the ground. It was the brutal, calculated precision of a soldier, not a rancher. Before Thorn could even process what had happened, Silas had tossed the rifle to Alara. "Stay back," he commanded, and he drew the large hunting knife from his belt as he advanced on the stunned and furious Thorn. This was not a battle for land or property. It was a primal confrontation between 2 opposing forces, the quiet honor of a man defending his home, and the rapacious greed of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. The wild, beautiful valley became their arena. Thorn, enraged and humiliated, drew his own ornate pistol, but Silas was too close, moving with the deadly grace of a panther. He knocked the gun from Thorn's hand with a sweep of his arm, and the 2 men crashed together. It was not a graceful fight. It was a desperate, grunting struggle in the mud and new spring grass. Thorn was larger, fueled by arrogance and fury, but Silas was harder, tempered by loss and a life of brutal self-reliance. He fought not with rage, but with a cold, focused purpose. He was defending more than just a cabin. He was defending the fragile, beautiful life that had taken root within it. He was defending hope, both the child and the concept. Alara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, the heavy rifle clutched in her hands. The men Thorn had brought were no longer a threat. One was nursing a shattered hand, the other writhing on the ground. Her focus was on the struggle, on the man who had become her entire world fighting for her. She saw Thorn land a desperate blow, catching Silas on the side of the head, and Silas stumbled. For a terrifying second, she thought Thorn would prevail. But Silas shook his head, a trickle of blood running from his temple, and his eyes, when he looked at Thorn, held a cold fire that made the other man quail. With a final surge of strength, Silas overpowered him, slamming him to the ground and pressing the flat of his knife against Thorn's throat. Thorn lay gasping, his fine clothes muddied, his arrogance shattered, the terror of his own mortality finally dawning in his eyes. Silas leaned in close, his voice a harsh whisper. "You will get on your horse. You will take your men, and you will ride out of this valley. If you ever return, if you ever so much as speak her name again, I will not wound your men. I will bury you where you stand. Do you understand me?" Thorn, utterly broken, could only manage a choked, terrified nod. Silas stood, pulling him to his feet and shoving him toward his horse. Without a backward glance, Bartholomew Thorn scrambled into the saddle and fled, his remaining man struggling to follow, leaving the wounded one behind. The silence that descended was profound. The threat was gone, vanquished not by wealth or power, but by the unyielding strength of a good man. Silas turned to Alara, his face bruised, his breathing heavy, and in his eyes, she saw not the triumph of a victor, but the deep, quiet relief of a protector. In the aftermath, standing before the cabin that had been their sanctuary and had almost become a battleground, the unspoken thing between them finally rose to the surface. He walked to her and gently took the rifle from her hands. He looked from her face to the cabin door, behind which their future slept soundly. "This is your home now, Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If you'll have it." She looked up at him, at this solitary, wounded man who had opened his heart and his home to her, who had faced down her demons and made them his own. "It's already my home," she whispered, tears of gratitude and love blurring her vision. "It has been for a long time." And there, in the quiet valley, surrounded by the promise of spring, they sealed their new beginning not with a kiss, but with a shared look of profound understanding. They were no longer two separate, broken people. They were a family. 1 year later, the sun that crested the mountains illuminated a scene transformed. The small, solitary cabin was no longer solitary. A new room had been added, built of the same sturdy timber, its windows facing the morning sun. A fence of split rails enclosed a thriving garden, heavy with corn, squash, and beans. The sound of a child's laughter, bright and clear as a mountain stream, echoed through the valley as a little girl with dark curls and her father's winter sky eyes toddled through the wildflowers, chasing a butterfly. Silas, his face no longer a mask of grief, but softened by a gentle contentment, watched her, a smile touching his lips. Alara came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, and stood beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. The easy, comfortable gesture spoke of 1,000 shared moments, of a love that had settled deep into their bones. They were husband and wife, their vows exchanged not before a preacher, but before the mountains, the only witnesses they needed. Silas had adopted Hope as his own, giving her his name and a father's unwavering devotion. He had found his redemption not in forgetting his past, but in building a new future from its ashes. Alara, once a frightened refugee, was now the strong, vibrant heart of their home, her quiet strength a constant, steady flame. They had healed each other, their broken pieces fitting together to create something whole and far more beautiful than what they had lost. Theirs was a quiet life, measured by the changing seasons and the growth of their daughter. A life rich in the things that truly mattered: love, security, and peace. What is it that truly makes a family? Is it blood, or is it the stubborn, beautiful choice to stand by someone, to build a shelter for them in the storm, to love them not in spite of their scars, but because of them? The story of Alara and Silas is a reminder that the most profound love stories are often the quietest ones, written not in grand pronouncements, but in the daily acts of kindness, protection, and devotion. It proves that a family can be found in the most unexpected of places, and that a home is not a structure of wood and nails, but a fortress built of love and courage. If their story of finding hope in the heart of a blizzard has moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might be weathering their own storm. For sometimes, the story of a fire built by a stranger is all the warmth we need to keep going. Thank you for listening.